Good afternoon. I welcome you all to this uh, update on a practical and protocol-based management of DME and PDR in 2021 and the evolving role of AI. I'm thankful to all of you for joining in. All of you know Dr. Rajiv Raman. He's medical director at Shankar Nethralaya. He'll be talking to us on AI in diabetic retinopathy. He has done huge amount of work, and I think whatever Google is coming out with is a significant contribution of Rajiv there. Dr. Manpreet Barar, who has recently backed the prize of a wonderful paper in IGO. She'll be talking to us about imaging. She's from Revala Institute. Dr. Dinesh Talwar, who is Director Retina Services at Center for Sight. He'll be talking to us on medical control of diabetic retinopathy and the use of anti-VEGF. Vishal, who is associate professor at SMS Medical College, Jaipur, a prolific retina surgeon, and he'll be covering on vitrectomy in DME and also on PDR because Manish, for some reason, has not been able to join in today for certain personal reasons. So we'll be certainly missing Manish for this. Dr. Neeraj Sanduja, my colleague, he'll be talking to us. He's the director of Vian Eye Center at Gurgaon, and he'll be talking to us the take homes from the clinical trials. Ritu, my better half, would be talking to us on cataract and diabetic retinopathy. And I'll be talking to you about pathobiology, epidemiology, diabetic retinopathy, as well as lasers and steroids. So epidemiology of diabetic retinopathy in India and pathobiology of DME and PDR, it's a huge topic. I'll try to cover up as rapidly as possible. We know that we have progressed from the DRS, ETDRS, DCCT, the diabetic vitrectomy study, and then we have had multiple other studies which have happened over the time with the use of anti-VEGFs. Uh, we have really evolved, and so have we evolved in our imaging techniques and our surgical techniques from 20 gauge to 27 gauge. And we have now artificial intelligence, as Dr. Rajiv will tell us about how we can predict which patients are going to respond to our treatment and which may not respond to our treatment. Diabetes, in midst of all this pandemic, there's an epidemic of diabetes all over the world, and you can see the distribution of the diabetes. And India happens to be the capital of this diabetic world with a rapidly increasing incidence all over the world. Though it is said that UAE probably has a higher prevalence, almost about 27% in the population, but in India, average is about 18 to 20% in patients over 40, 45 years. So these are some of the prevalence studies reported, including the last one, which shows the prevalence is 18% reported from Shankar Nethralaya, where Rajiv was involved in it. So an average incidence comes out to roughly between 15 to 20%, and this has covered both the urban and the rural population, though earlier we used to say that rural prevalence is a little less, maybe around 7 to 14%, but overall it's all catching up, and average is a huge population of diabetics in our country which need to be handled. And the best way to do that is to screen them. And this just really shows us that how much of our resources have to be spent on screening and treating these diabetic patients. And as ophthalmologists, we have a significant role. Now, this just shows when we compare the amount of expenditure that is required and that is being done in various countries. So this is the amount of expenditure in billion US dollars which is being spent, and the amount which actually India is doing than what is required. The estimated burden of diabetes is high, and thus we have to really manage our diabetic retinopathy and DME. Out of the total population, 8.3% of the people have diabetes. 35% of the patients with diabetes have diabetic retinopathy, of whom 7% will have DME. So this shows the amount of treatment burden in terms of anti-VEGFs. But most important is that we have to control them well with metabolically, and if we do that, the chances of our patients becoming blind is going to be less. Now, please remember, every diabetic is a potential candidate for diabetic retinopathy. 80% of diabetics need only to be followed and managed well systemically. Only 20% need active intervention by a specialist. Many a times they will come with symptomless because most of them have to be caught early. If we catch them late and they have symptoms like those of complications because of retinopathy, that's already late. Hence, it's important to screen them. That means a huge number of people have to have a fundus examination. So our aim as ophthalmologists, as retina specialists, should be to prevent the progression of diabetes and to catch them early so that we can treat them. This was a very important paper, which Rajiv may remember, which was published quite some time back, but it just showed that for sight-threatening diabetic retinopathy, the cutoff level for HbA1c was about 8%. So people normally come and ask us how much HbA1c we should maintain. At least we normally tell them it should be below 7 because the International Diabetic Association, as well as the American Diabetic Association, the levels are falling on a regular basis. And right now it's about 6.1. But if you can keep our patients below 7, it is good enough. So anything below 8, the sight-threatening diabetic retinopathy can be significantly reduced. Coming to a little bit of the pathobiology, it's a huge topic to cover, but basically to show this is the normal vasculature. There's loss of pericytes due to apoptosis with the endothelial outpouching, formation of the microaneurysms. We know what Stalin's hypothesis is, and in the patient of diabetic macular edema, there is an increase in the hydrostatic pressure because of increased BP. There is a decrease in the oncotic pressure because of proteinuria due to nephropathy. There is a capillary wall damage, as I said, because of loss of pericytes. And there is an abnormal leaching, which leads to accumulation of intercellular fluid. And because of capillary non-perfusion, neovascularization, and hence all these problems of hyperglycemia, which I'll be just alluding to. Just to represent it pictorially, there is capillary occlusion, which leads to capillary non-perfusion, and there is leakage. And this leads to macular edema or the retinal edema. And because of capillary non-perfusion, there is release of vasoformative factors, which we're all aware, and Dr. Dinesh should be talking to us on the role of anti-VEGFs, and this leads to the neovascularization. So there are 5 pathological processes which basically happen: formation of microaneurysms, increased vascular permeability, vascular occlusion, neovascularization and bleeding. There is contraction of the new blood vessels, scarring and retinal detachment, and there is, because of various reasons, there is altered neurotransmission. And when you have vitreous hemorrhage, you can have media opacities, which optically prevents vision from the patient from seeing. So this is a little busy slide, but however, there's a lot of metabolic changes which are involved in diabetic retinopathy. Suffice to say that there is the role of VEGF, there is the role of pro-inflammatory markers, there is increased vascular permeability, and there is angiogenesis, and there are neurogenic influences. So these are some of the biochemical markers in diabetic macular edema. For want of time, I will not go into the details of each. And we know that there is increased involvement of the advanced glycation end products. These are important, and this is responsible for the various metabolic problems that occur throughout the body, including diabetic retinopathy. So we know that there are diabetes has microvascular complications which occur in the brain, heart, and extremities, and microvascular complications that occur in eye, kidney, and as well as neuropathy. So it's important to monitor all of them together. And the most feared complication, if you look at people, it's the is feeling of loss of visual acuity. I know it's very extensive, so we're short of time, but I think we'll cover this subsequently. And just to introduce that, we have all learned about CSME, those three criteria, but DRCR.net divided it into a center involving DME and a non-center involving DME, which because the center involving DME is treated with anti-VEGF, while the non-center involving DME we can treat with lasers. So this is just a pictorial representation of CSME. And I'll be alluding to this again in my second talk of how is the center involving DME is important and why we should do laser for the non-center involving diabetic macular edema. This is further classification of the center involving diabetic macular edema. And the next talk is actually on imaging, and I would ask Dr. Manpreet to talk on that. But since Dr. Rajiv has to join another session, so I would request Dr. Rajiv to tell us about his experience and his about artificial intelligence in diabetic retinopathy. I've been really wanting to hear Rajiv talk on this.
Thanks, Dr. Ajay. Thanks for putting up such a nice program. I'll be missing a part of it, but next couple of minutes, I'll try to share some of the thoughts. Dr. Ajay gave me two topics actually. 1 minute, this is coming in between. I have to just move this in one corner. Yeah. AI for diabetic retinopathy and algorithmic approach in management of PDR and DME. So I will try to cover both of them in the next 8 minutes. So rather than going, because AI, as Dr. Ajay rightly said, it's not only for screening. Today we have AI in many of our diagnostic modalities, and people are trying to find out that how well we can use it to predict the treatment response. In this talk, I'll be just talking about how AI is used for diabetic retinopathy screening. So what do the guidelines say about AI to be used? And 2020 American Diabetic Association included AI for DR screening. And they said that any system which is FDA approved and can detect more than mild NPDR and DME can be authorized to use, and it can be an alternative to a traditional screening approach. However, they also went ahead saying that the results of screening should be documented and a loop should be completed by properly referring it to a healthcare professional. They also said that when AI should not be used, one, if a person already is a known patient of retinopathy, AI doesn't have much role, he should visit ophthalmologist, or if he is on a prior retinopathy treatment, or if he has symptoms of visual impairment, again, AI is not something which you should use for. Even the AIOS guidelines have included AI, and because we don't have a proper legal framework in India, the consensus which came out was that if you are using AI for screening, anybody who has diabetic retinopathy, which is referred by the AI algorithm, should be seen by ophthalmologist, and a subset of normal, 10% of them, if AI has identified normal, that image should be graded by a ophthalmologist too. Are these algorithms accurate? So this was our initial work in 2016, and last year it was just one of the top 10 articles of the decade by JAMA, where we first time showed that AI or a deep learning algorithm can detect referable diabetic retinopathy from retinal images with a fairly good accuracy, comparable to even a retina specialist. Since then, there have been lots of these algorithms which have come, and good thing is accuracies of nearly all of them or most of them is reasonably good. So what to look for when you are selecting an algorithm? You should look for their initial study, what were the number of images they had used in the training set. So in our JAMA paper or that study, we have found a cutoff that after 60,000 images, the learning doesn't improve. So if you look at an algorithm with a fairly small sample of images which were used for training, it may not be that robust. Most important is how was the ground truth ascertained in the initial, because you need to compare the algorithm with the ground truth. And there can be multiple ways: grading by a retina specialist, grading by graders. You can have two people grading or 2 and 1 education. So you must look at how robust the ground truth was ascertained in their initial study. Again, it's important to know whether the algorithm was trained on a mydriatic image or a non-mydriatic image, because that will alter. And because it's not same. If it's a non-mydriatic image, you want to actually use how you intend to use in your clinical practice. Whether the algorithm was trained on a single field versus multiple fields is again something you need to look for. Like IDX has been not trained on a single image, but multiple images. And when you do your screening, if you are doing screening on a single field, probably that may not suffice. So selecting algorithm mainly depends on the circumstances of intended screening. How you want to screen the population, what is your target population? You want to use a non-mydriatic camera or use a non-mydriatic camera with mydriasis. You want to take one field or multiple field. Many things depend on that. Is the performance of an algorithm dependent on camera? So this was a work which we did in Thailand. So we tried comparing. There we had a chance of using nearly 10 cameras, different non-mydriatic, mydriatic cameras across various districts. And we had human grading. So what we found that the human grading definitely varies with the camera. However, if the images are gradable, the AI grading was more or less consistent. If it's a non-gradable image, then both will give a bad result. So for a gradable image, the camera may not be a very important consideration as far as the performance of AI is concerned. There are a lot of efforts which are going on improving the efficiency of AI algorithms. And this is one of our recent work where we labeled the DME from the OCT. So we took the retinal images and labeled the OCT center involving or non-center involving, and labeled that. You can see in the second picture, clinically you may not appreciate that there is any edema there. So clinical grading was no maculopathy. However, on OCT there is a center involving macular edema. So we trained the model using the OCT grades and could reach a reasonable good 0.89 AUC. That means that just putting these images and using this type of algorithm, you can find the information which you can get on a OCT. This is another recent work which got published. It was in one of our multicentric study. We created an algorithm which can detect a non-gradable image with a fairly good accuracy. This is again important because if at the site who are taking the images, if we can give this information that the image would be ungradable, they can retake the image. So that's something which is now improving. How we implement AI screening in our clinical practice. So people have been doing various ways. At Aravind, they have placed these algorithms with the camera at a physician clinic. Basically, it's a fully automatic grading. So there is nothing like the person there doesn't know how to grade diabetic retinopathy. Images are uploaded, and if the AI says a referral, he goes to a ophthalmologist. On contrary, we are using it at Shankar Nethralaya more as an assistive mode for anterior segment specialists who have knowledge, but they are not involved in diabetic retinopathy screening or treatment. So the images are uploaded. The ophthalmologist also has a chance to grade the image, and then the AI grading is shown to him. He can augment the grading, or he may, if he feels he's correct, he can. So this is a chance for even his learning and we use it more like the assistive mode. This is a small video which shows that how we use it in our clinic. So it is integrated with the EMR, and the optometrist, while taking the workup, he takes a consent. The images are uploaded, and once he uploads the image, he also uploads some other information, whether it was dilated or cataract was there or not, and he inserts it into the EMR. He is then seen by the consultant, so he enters through his login. He has a chance to look at the image, grade the images, and then he says view AI results. And based on that, if he wants, if there is difference, he can again change, or he may continue having the same advice. So this is the initial 350 patient experience using in the clinic, and as compared to the ophthalmologist grading, the accuracy seems to be pretty good, maintaining what we saw in our study, more than 0.885. Regarding referable retinopathy, meaning severe NPDR, PDR, and DME, sensitivity specificity again is pretty high in this group of population, the pilot study which we had done in the hospital. We also used another AI algorithm which was developed in Korea to try to see, can we reduce the referral? So we kept this in the glaucoma clinic, and there it graded and we took the ground truth from the retina specialist, and you can see fairly good sensitivity specificity, just 5 minutes more. We could get even in, so this is one of the way it can be utilized to reduce the referrals. What is the acceptance of AI among ophthalmologists? So this was, I'm sure many of you would have got this questionnaire, which last lockdown we had circulated, and you'll soon see this in Lancet, the APPRAISE study. So nearly about 1,170 ophthalmologists from 70 countries, including India. The good thing is acceptance seems to be good, and we also did a machine learning model to predict the acceptance, which is again pretty high. I'll not go in details of it. Algorithmic approach, I'll just show this. So basically, once you diagnose a patient to have diabetic retinopathy, you evaluate systemic condition, do a good clinical evaluation, you're looking at macular edema, and you see whether it is center involving or not. If it is not center involving, as Dr. Ajay Arora rightly said, laser or observation. And if it is center involving, you look at if the vision is good. If vision is good, we just observe. If vision is poor, you go ahead with anti-VEGF in pseudophakic. You can think of using Ozurdex. And if there is poor response, you have a chance of you either switching anti-VEGF, adding laser, or adding steroid. And if it's a chronic disease, you again consider more towards steroid. Non-center involving, again, whether it is treatment name non-center involving, or it has converted from a center involving to a non-center involving, based on that, your decision will change. Again, it's not ground rule, because there are a lot of specific conditions where you might need to change the treatment a little bit. I think the future talks will cover this. PRP is a mainstay still in proliferative diabetic retinopathy. However, there are situations where you may want to deviate. If you have a single NV with a PDR with a good compliance patient, you can consider anti-VEGF as a treatment option. If there is a PDR with no traction and again good compliance, you can consider, but if compliance becomes poor, add PRP. If it's a tractional away from the fovea, you again go ahead with PRP, 2 disc diameter away from the tractional detachments. If it is associated with center involving macular edema, you can definitely, it's a good idea to combine with anti-VEGF. If it's an active PDR after a complete PRP, you can still try, if there is some areas where you can do a supplemental PRP, or you want to assess, also you should assess the presence of active new vessel versus a mature vessel, because these mature vessels, whatever you do will remain like that. With NVI, you want to do an aggressive PRP and add a anti-VEGF. And if it is a proliferative retinopathy, vitreous hemorrhage, PDR vitreous hemorrhage, post-vitrectomy, early vitreous hemorrhage, you observe. Late vitreous hemorrhage, you can assess with a UBM and then consider whether you want to give only anti-VEGF or probably may need a surgery. Thank you very much. I'll be happy to take any questions. Ajay, you are mute. You have to unmute, Ajay.
So sorry. Does anybody have any questions for Rajiv?
Yeah, I wanted to ask Dr. Rajiv,
Please.
excellent presentation. So Dr. Rajiv, are you routinely now incorporated the AI as part of the, SOP at Shankara Nethralaya? Or is
See,
it?
the biggest challenge is getting so many fundus cameras. So at least in few of the floors, we have kept a camera where definitely it's a routine. During workup, if he's a diabetic, image is taken and all those things happen. But we are not able to scale it up to the whole hospital because ideally there are 110 workup rooms. So ideally you should have 110 cameras. Then you can make sure that all of them they undergo. But definitely I've like glaucoma clinic, we have kept one, we have kept in cornea clinic. So there people are using. In a day, at least I would say 35 to 40 patients they undergo in each floor.
What about your centers which are, say vision centers or,
Yeah, that model is there at Arvind. We don't have vision center. Our model is a tertiary care hospital. That's the reason we have been more using it as an assistive mode. But at Arvind, yes, they have not kept in vision centers, but they started with a physician clinic. So they have at least 8 to 10 physician clinic where they are using this, but in a fully automatic mode.
So Rajiv, with the AI, can you predict which patient is going to respond to anti-VEGF versus not?
Yes, I didn't cover that in my talk, but that's something which is not yet in the practice today, but a lot of work is happening. One of our work with Zeiss, it is now getting patented. Fairly good accuracy is more than 90% we can get, but it's not only the OCT data. That's what clinically also we know, that you need to put the OCT data and patient-related data both, like visual acuity, the duration of diabetes, and multiple things. You get the accuracies of the algorithm improve.
Yeah. So if you can tell the sex of a person by looking at the fundus image or the age, I'm sure
yes.
you can tell all these things. So
yes,
does
absolutely.
Anybody have any other questions? I wish Rajiv had stayed back because there's so many questions will come up on the way. So if Rajiv, you have time, you can join us back.
Once I finish my talk there, I'll join you.
Wonderful, because it will be wonderful to have you.
Yeah. Sure. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Thank you so much. So next we have Dr. Manpreet. Manpreet, are you there?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hello.
So put your video camera on.
Yeah.
We want to see you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Good evening, ma'am. Good evening.
Good evening, Manpreet, and congratulations for winning that IGO prize yesterday.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Manpreet will be talking to us on imaging in diabetic retinopathy. She is doing stupendous amount of work on various modalities. Share your screen.
Okay, so if everything is visible, I'm gonna start it now.
Yes, you can.
मैंने उसको मना कर दिया. मेरे को आ गया रूपक सिंगला का फोन आ गया था. वो कहा था अभी इमरजेंसी वार्ड भेज दो, मेरे को पेशेंट का नाम बता दो. Management of diabetic retinopathy. So I'll be covering fluorescein angiograms, OCT, and OCT angiography. So I'll kickstart with fluorescein angiography. So it's basically detection of retinal vessels and leakage by injecting a fluorescein dye in your periphery. Now the flow diagram here depicts how the dye will reach the eye. So once it is injected into the peripheral vein, comes into the circulatory system, will reach the internal carotid, then the ophthalmic artery, and then the retinal and choroidal circulation. So choroid filling is a second prior to the retinal filling. Now this is a quick video to show the choroidal, arterial, arteriovenous, and the venous phase
In a diabetic, the arteriovenous phase of the angiogram usually depicts the retinal vascular abnormalities. FSE details are also better appreciated. We can see abnormal neovascular fronts, small dot-like microaneurysms, and an area of non-filling, what we commonly call them as capillary non-perfusion areas. All these details much easily seen in the early arteriovenous phase of the angiogram. So now coming to the role of fluorescein angiography in diabetic retinopathy, it's basically to guide the laser treatment for diabetic macular edema and to identify suspected neovascularization. It is also used at times to evaluate the unexplained vision loss in a diabetic. It will be better explained once we share the situations. So in case of a mild to moderate NPDR, you don't need an angiogram unless there is an associated DME and you want to know the details of. So FFA in mild to moderate NPDR is needed. In case of severe NPDR, at times it helps you to differentiate it from an early PDR. Now, the early frame of fluorescein angiography here depicts an intraretinal microvascular abnormality seen in the nasal retina, which clearly does not leak in the late phase, and thus ruling out that it was not an NVE, it was not a case of a PDR. So you could kind of wait to start your PRP. It is not a critical indication. In case of proliferative diseases, even though the diagnosis is clear-cut, but if there's any doubt, you can always run an angiogram to confirm the source and the number of NVs and also to know about the diabetic macular edema. Now here, the patient had blocked fluorescence from a preretinal bleed with NVE, which is seen in the superior-nasal quadrant. This classifies it as a high-risk PDR and need for an urgent PRP laser, whereas the other picture shows multiple NVEs in a case of a low-risk disease. Now, in cases with mild vitreous hemorrhage, again, fluorescein helps you to confirm the source of the bleed. Like here, the fundus depicts mild vitreous bleed. The fluorescein angiogram early and the late phase picks up an NVD at the disc, which is more than 1/4, confirming this as a case of PDR. However, in case of dense vitreous hemorrhage, fluorescein angiogram is not important as it will fail to give you any significant information. So rather, next, does it have any role after treatment? At times, yes. It confirms the successful regression of the NVE following the PRP. Now, this image is taken 3 months post-laser treatment. No new NVEs were detected, hence indicating that you have retina for a while. Now, in this particular case, it's a type 1 diabetic treated with PRP for PDR 3 years back. Came for a regular checkup. Fluorescein angiography confirms the presence of an NVE inferior-temporally, and thus suggesting that a PRP augmentation would be probably helpful in the long. Coming to the role of fluorescein angiography in diabetic macular underlying pathology. Now, this is situation number 1, where the focal leaks from the microaneurysms is identified inferior-temporal to the fovea in case of a non-center DME. All you need to do is good focal laser to your microaneurysms, and remember not to treat within the 5 central fovea. This is situation 2, again a diabetic treated previously with macular laser. The laser spots are visible on the superior temporal part of the macula. Now the DME is identified on the OCT scan, but once you run your angiography, you know the real source, and which are these microaneurysms which are not been previously lasered, if the patient is not willing for an anti-VEGF. Now, this is again a diabetic macular edema with gross DME and OCT. So until you run an angiography, you won't realize that here you are dealing with an ischemic. So to summarize, FFA is important at baseline to identify the type of DMEs to treatment. Now, moving on to what we know as ultra-wide field fluorescein angiography. So the traditional fundus photography FFA captures around 75 degrees of your fields, whereas with the help of ultra-wide field, you can visualize up to degrees. And thus, the peripheral NVEs, which are usually missed by the traditional FFA, can be easily picked up. Now, moving on to the OCT, optical coherence tomography, the most widely and commonly used diagnostic imaging modality these days. This is how a normal OCT looks like. I won't be going into the details. Now, the common indications of OCT use in diabetic retinopathy is what we have to discuss responses. Now, this is a very traditional classification of a diabetic macular edema on OCT, which is based on the morphology or the presence of obstruction. In clinical practice, these are the common patterns that we see. So this is a case of a diffuse diabetic macular edema. You can very clearly see enlarged hyperreflective space diabetic macular edema. Now this is the cystic type where you see large hyperreflective oval intraretinal cystic fluid spaces in the outer plexiform, outer nuclear layer, and at times the tiny ones in the inner nuclear layer as well. So I'll kickstart with
there is a little blockage here.
phobia, and the tractional component to the DME is of importance for your clinic. Well, now another way in which the clinical practice or the non-random and the randomized trials they usually work is to differentiate as center involving DME or the non-center involving DME. So for most of the ST-OCTs, the cutoff value is around 280 to 290 microns. Anything more DME. Typical non-center DME, you have lasered it 6 months. This is pre, this is post. You can see the foveal thickness was normal before, continues to be normal after initiated.
Skip that, we're running out of time, and I'll just quickly move on to the OCT angiographies. Yeah.
Now, moving on to the OCT angiography is the most fancy, easy to use, non-invasive way of doing it. Now, the OCTA images, they are viewed in tandem with corresponding structural NFAS and cross-sectional OCT scans. It has the ability to visualize each vascular plexus separately. And so in a diabetic patient, it's usually the VR interface, superficial, and the deep plexus is what we usually look at. That's how the image is usually seen up on the screen. Then you have to analyze the different vascular plexus. This is the CC layer, and this picture is taken at plexus. Now the conventional OCT images will capture only the 3 mm and the central 6 mm scans. The quantitative OCT parameters also helps you to understand the logistics about how you differentiate. Now, image on your left is a fluorescein angiogram in case of a PDR. Conventional standard OCTA frames will not pick up required details, but if you have the OCTA wide field montages, they show the complete details, and they add a very easy non-invasive diagnostic modality to pick up the PDR cases. Again, a 12 by 12 mm montage image of the OCTA, it has the ability to identify almost all the peripheral NVEs as seen by the RAM. Again, repeatable follow-up exams can be easily performed. Color fundus image shows a florid NVD seen on the OCTA image, as well as post-laser OCTA did not pick up any NVD, and hence confirming the successful regression of your. This is another example, drastic reduction in the caliber of NVE with pruned edges falling in direction. Now, this is something where the world is heading towards, that is to classify the different stages using OCTA montages. The first picture is of a moderate NPDR. The second picture is of a severe NPDR, where you see a lot of non-perfusions, but no clear-cut NVEs or NVD. The last picture is of a case of a PDR with the florid NVEs easily seen up on the and thank you very much.
So nice presentation, Dr. Manpreet. if you can unshare. And only thing is at times your audio was a little not getting connected well, but well. So since you have all the equipment available at GI, do you normally do your angiographies or you switch over to OCT angio in most of the cases? And the patient walks in for that. Can you're muted, Manpreet, you can unmute yourself? Yes.
Okay, so for all practical purposes, we have kind of moved on to the wide field OCT angiograms only in a diabetic. Very rarely we have to go back to a fluorescein angiogram in case, you know, there is a clear-cut doubt that whether it is severe NPDR or a PDR, and we can't really confirm it. But with the help of just a standard B scan, the OCT scan, we can kind of differentiate a flat NVE from an IRMA. So really haven't done fluorescein angiogram anymore for a routine practice. Yeah.
All right. Anybody has any questions for Manpreet, or because for paucity of time, we can move on because we need to finish up all the talks. And welcome, Dinesh. A very happy birthday to you.
Thank you.
Could have sung you a song at the beginning of the session, but we're in the midst of the session. We'll probably sing it at the end. So let me invite, thanks Manpreet. Let's invite, and stay back, Manpreet, don't, somebody may have some questions for you. Neeraj will be talking on clinical trials and their relevance in treatment.
Thank you,
Neeraj, can you please share your screen?
Yeah, thank you for this opportunity, Dr. Ajay. So it's visible, Dr. Ajay?
Yeah, it's visible.
Okay. So I'll be speaking on clinical trials in diabetic retinopathy and their practical implications. These trials, which were done to see the systemic control of diabetes on diabetic retinopathy way back in 1990s, diabetes control complication trial, Euclid's, UKPDS, Accord study, field study, they all showed metabolic control is of paramount importance to reduce the progression of diabetic retinopathy. So basically, it is a multimodality treatment. And as far as the treatment of diabetic retinopathy and diabetic macular edema is concerned, we have come a far way from laser photocoagulation, intravitreal steroid injections, and now we are into anti-VEGF era. And the focus of treatment has shifted from CSME to central involving diabetic macular edema. So we have all of those questions, which patient to treat with anti-VEGF or laser or steroid, what to use. So various clinical trials, they have given us insight how exactly we should treat such patients. So READ2 trial was to see whether laser treatment in conjunction with anti-VEGF has additional benefit or not. So this was a study where patients were assigned to grid laser alone, ranibizumab alone, and ranibizumab with grid alone. So it was seen that the patients who were assigned with the only ranibizumab monotherapy, they had a more better visual outcome in terms of 7.24 letters if you compare with other groups, and better visual acuity at 12 months time. And interestingly, it was seen that if you're adding laser to VEGF therapy, anti-VEGF therapy, it resulted in fewer ranibizumab injection without a major disadvantage in visual outcome. And that exactly we run into our clinical practice also. We do laser photocoagulation and the macular edema has come down to reduce the number of injections. RESTORE was another study which was a 12-month phase 3 trial to see the ranibizumab monotherapy or ranibizumab combined with laser or laser monotherapy. And injections were given minimum of 3 injections till the disease stability was achieved, and they were reinitiated when the disease recurred again. And in this study, the mean visual acuity at 12 months was also significantly better, the patient who received this anti-VEGF monotherapy from patient who received laser monotherapy. And there was improvement of more than 10 letters in patients. Basically, it was 37.4% with ranibizumab monotherapy and 43% again with the treatment was combined with laser. So, but in the laser group, the visual recovery was not good. Another issue was to see whether these drugs, anti-VEGF drugs, how efficacious they are and what is their systemic safety. So this was answered by RESOLVE trial. where the patients were assigned to sham treatment, ranibizumab 0.3 milligram and 0.5 milligram, and the dose was increased after 1 month if there was no effect with the previous lesser dosage. And photocoagulation after 3 injections was required as a rescue treatment wherever required. And if you see clearly, the patients who had ranibizumab group, they had better visual acuity of 9.6 letters and than the sham treatment. And even the central retinal thickness was much less in patients who received monotherapy. And as far as the safety and of this drug was concerned, there was no any increased rate of cardiovascular, cerebrovascular accident, or no ocular side effects were seen. Another question was whether laser, steroid, or anti-VEGF therapy, which is better. So this was answered by a protocol I to see the effect on diabetic macular edema. And the patients were assigned to sham or prompt laser treatment, ranibizumab with prompt laser treatment, or ranibizumab with deferred laser, and triamcinolone plus prompt laser. And this study showed that more than 50% of the patients had more than 10 letter visual acuity gain, while 30% gained more than 15 letters with anti-VEGF and steroid treatment. And this steroid treatment was especially beneficial in pseudophakic eyes. And that exactly we also follow. In pseudophakic eyes, we give intravitreal Ozurdex injection for such patients. So the question is, which treatment regime to choose, whether we should give monthly injection, or we should choose PRN therapy, or we should make it treat and extend therapy. So this was answered by a written study. And in this study, the patients are assigned to ranibizumab with laser, treat and extend ranibizumab, and PRN ranibizumab group. And if you see this in treat and extend therapy, 3 injections were given as a loading dose. If the vision was stable, then and again 1 month period was given, and the injections were given after 2 months. If the vision was stable, then again gap of 2 months was, from 1 month it was extended to 2 months. So this was how the treat and extend regime was formulated. If you see all the patients in whether it was a treat and extend, PRN, or monthly regime, all these patients were having good visual acuity at 24 months. And the lesser number of injections were required, the patients who received the treat and extend therapy. So basically, treat and extend therapy reduces the number of injections and reduces number of visits to your clinic. And it may be an optimal therapy in terms of giving good visual outcome. And in cases of persistent DME, this was protocol due to see the evaluation of combination of dexamethasone with ranibizumab versus ranibizumab alone for persistent central involvement diabetic macular edema. And the patients are assigned to sham and ranibizumab treatment and dexamethasone with anti-VEGF therapy. And this is how you can see the visual outcome was almost good in both the cases. But the retinal thickness was more significant, where the patient received both dexamethasone and ranibizumab. But if you look at the increased IOP, which was seen only in combination therapy, none of the cases with ranibizumab group. And eyes with at least non-ocular adverse event was more in combination group than ranibizumab group. So mean visual improvement at 6 months was as good in combination group and as good in monotherapy group. But yes, reduction in retinal thickness was more with steroid and ranibizumab group. So I think even monotherapy is also good for that treatment. In protocol T, aflibercept, bevacizumab, or ranibizumab for diabetic macular edema were given. And this was the first head-to-head trial of all the 3 anti-VEGF therapy. And overall, if you see the maximum visual gain was aflibercept group, if you compare with bevacizumab and ranibizumab group. And central thickness was also less than this aflibercept group. Protocol V was to see the effect of initial management with aflibercept versus laser photocoagulation versus observation on visual loss among patients who had visual acuity of more than 20/25. And it was seen that there was no effect whether you give the treatment or don't give treatment, and the visual acuity remains same in all the cases. So it says that if vision is better than 20/25, you should not give any treatment to such patients, just observation. In protocol W, effect of intravitreal anti-VEGF therapy with versus sham treatment for prevention of vision-threatening complication of diabetic retinopathy in moderate to severe NPDR without central involvement diabetic macular was seen. And patients were assigned to 2 milligram of aflibercept or sham treatment given at 1, 2, and 4 months, and every 4 months through 2 years. And aflibercept was administered in both the groups in case there was central involvement diabetic macular edema. And 2-year cumulative probability of developing PDR was much less in aflibercept group than in the sham group. But we need to see whether how effective it is going to be in terms of patient management from the cost point of view, and also the number of injections we give. It is also for traumatic for the patient also. So to conclude, metabolic control is of paramount importance. Anti-VEGF is a practical choice for central involvement. Treat and extend seems to be a better regime, and steroids are indicated. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Neeraj. If you could unshare, and maybe Dinesh, you could share your screen so that we can save a little time. And just a question, Neeraj, that do you use these protocols which you mentioned while you communicate with the patients? Does it help you in communicating better with the patients?
Actually, we tell them like whatever we are doing with standard guidelines which have been given in literature and studies, and we follow some protocol for such patients. But yes, in Indian scenario, all these things may not be practical for all the patients. So we have to look at the patient scenario, what he can afford and how frequently he can visit. But we try to follow the regime, PRN regime or treat and extend. And treat and extend, yes, we have started following that, and the number of injections are much less than the PRN basis.
Thanks, Neeraj, for paucity of time. I think if we have time in the end, stay back. We will have.
I have to go for another talk. So.
Oh, okay, fine. Sure. Thank you so much. So we have Dr. Dinesh Talwar, who is talking to us on anti-VEGF in diabetic macular edema and proliferative diabetic retinopathy. Over to you, Dinesh.
Right. Thank you, Ajay. So, this is my disclaimer and the financial disclosure. Today, everyone thinks anti-VEGF agents are a panacea, almost for all retinal disorders. Then when somebody says, well, this is a microangiopathy, say like diabetes, so wow, this is something for all cases of diabetic retinopathy, maybe anti-VEGF agents may have a role. Too simplistic, isn't it? Absolutely. Diabetic retinopathy is a continuum. It goes all the way from preclinical stage to advanced end-stage diabetic eye disease. So when all can you use anti-VEGF agents, and what should you do for the rest of the patients is something which we will see now. So obviously, if you have if you start looking at the treatment points in diabetic retinopathy, the first stage is no retinopathy or early NPDR. And it stands to reason that medical treatment is probably the best way to go for this. For patients who have diabetic maculopathy, proliferative diabetic retinopathy, or sequelae of proliferative diabetic retinopathy like vitreous hemorrhage, obviously there is a need for active ocular management. I must first stress on the fact that that medical control is not just for the sake of speaking. Medical control is something extremely important, and you can get very good control, a very good effect on diabetic maculopathy by controlling diabetes. And these are two slides from a friend of mine, Dr. Vatsal Parekh from Mumbai, and he shows how even patients who were only managed on good medical control, the maculopathy also started improving over time. So this is an essential part of the treatment for moderate to severe diabetic retinopathy as well as maculopathy. The issues for maculopathy are, well, is laser obsolete now? And if anti-VEGFs, which to use when? And if you want steroids, then when should you change? Let's go through some of this. There is this impression going around that laser is deleterious for diabetic maculopathy. And people quote to the poorer results as compared to the deferred laser group. in RESTORE and DRCR. There are two fallacies over here. First thing is they are considering that center involving macular edema is only having leaks within the macula. They don't. Center involving macular edema can have leaks which are more than 500 microns from the foveal center. And thus they may be amenable to focal macular laser. And both in protocol I and DRCR net, almost 50% of patients did have such lesions. So this is important. The second thing is, this is the slide based on which people are saying, oh, well, the deferred laser group does better than the prompt laser group. And if you look into the subgroup analysis, you find there is no difference between the laser group and the deferred laser group if you take only focal laser. When you talk of grid laser, diffuse diabetic macular edema, yes, the results fall, the results drop. So it is grid which is the worsening agent, not the laser per se. And that is what you must keep in mind. Focal laser does not compromise visual outcome. Now, to use anti-VEGFs for DME, my OCT is the initial part of the workup. We use anti-VEGF treatment to decrease the severity of the edema. And then we, before we do focal macular laser, we do a fluorescein angiography, and we laser all spots more than 750 micron from the foveal center. And subsequently, we give anti-VEGF agents as required. This is an example of a patient with multiple focal leaks, some within 750 micron of the foveal center and some further away. So you give an anti-VEGF agent, bring down the edema, then do the laser. Then after you've done the laser, you go ahead and give anti-VEGF agents for any further edema that may be left. The question about which agent to use when. So if the patient's vision is better than 618, makes no difference which drug you're using, and the gold standard I would still use as ranibizumab. For patients with a vision less than 618, initially aflibercept would be a good choice, followed by ranibizumab for maintenance, or ranibizumab as required. Now the question is, why not bevacizumab as the preferred choice? We'll come to that later. Why aflibercept is coming from the point that those with poorer vision did better with aflibercept as compared to ranibizumab. But over a period of 2 years, that difference does become muted. So there's not so much of a difference with either of these two drugs. But if you see bevacizumab versus the other two drugs, the drying is much less with bevacizumab as compared to ranibizumab and aflibercept, and which is why I prefer to give ranibizumab as my drug of choice, or aflibercept. There is no emergency. You can wait for up to a month or two, because you see over here, even waiting for 12 months and starting PRN after that, the treatment did come to the same point. So that's not the outcome came to the same point. So as initial treatment, how do you manage if the patient has got very good, if the patient's near vision is very good, distant vision is very good, I would not treat. And protocol V has confirmed that. You won't give them any advantage, and many of them will get up to 8-9 injections in the process. If the near and distant vision are affected, or one of them is affected, I would definitely treat these patients with anti-VEGF agents. And the treatment is given PRN from initiation till you get a control of the foveal contour and visual acuity. Now, when do you give steroids? Only if the patient's vision does not improve, or the OCT doesn't improve, with 2 consecutive injections or 3 consecutive OCTs are stable. Remember, anti-VEGF agents per se, just ranibizumab is the best biomarker by far. You see over here, if patients do not need an injection at month 3 and month 4 after receiving the first injection the first 3 months, these patients will not require more than an average of 4 injections in the whole year. And these are the patients who have a very good prognosis. On the other hand, the patients who don't do well, they're 20% who require injections every month for 2 years, and these are the ones where we don't do this, we will shift to steroids. If you have a patient who is not responding to anti-VEGFs, steroid and injection of Ozurdex can make all the difference. As you see here, 1 injection and you broke through the defenses, and this can then help you to get a response. In proliferative diabetic retinopathy, the issue of lasers, anti-VEGFs, or maybe both. So, well, if you give anti-VEGFs or steroids in combination with laser, you can decrease the macular edema and get better visual outcomes. So how do I use anti-VEGFs in PDR? I will just come to that. First of all, the protocol S showed that the main difference was actually in the fields. And actually, if you see this difference, these are the peripheral fields. If you see, was in other studies which have done, they found 88% of patients post-laser PRP can pass their their driving test. So it's not as if it's such a big problem. Now, what did anti-VEGF agents achieve with monotherapy? In patients without DME in the Protocol S trial, 7 injections were needed in the first year, 10 in the second year. And in those with DME, 9 in the first year, 14 in the second year. But the number of injections came down in those who had PRP. Keep that in mind. So how would I prefer to treat these patients? Proliferative diabetic retinopathy with maculopathy, if the neovascularization is raised, complete the laser first and the anti-VEGF agents later. If it's a flat neovascularization, I would go ahead with a laser soon after an anti-VEGF drug. And if there are patients with NVE persistent after adequate laser, I would go ahead and give anti-VEGF agents. What is the role of monotherapy? We'll come to that. But as you can see from this, I prefer a combination of PRP with anti-VEGF agents as the optimal approach. And many studies have documented that this is the best way to go. For monotherapy, I will only give it if the patient is counseled. You may need 14 or more injections in 2 years. You need to come for a regular follow-up. If you don't come for follow-up, you could actually land up with traction retinal detachments, which require surgery or vitreous hemorrhage. You could end up without addition of PRP. These number of injections will increase significantly, especially if there's macular edema. In fact, it's seen that if you have macular edema and you give PRP, the number of injections for macular edema also go down. So keep that in mind. Monotherapy with anti-VEGFs is like catching a tiger by the tail. Don't do it. Don't take it lightly. Do it only after complete counseling. Otherwise, you may end up in trouble if your patients don't come for follow-up. I don't give anti-VEGF agents in patients with vitreous hemorrhage as a primary therapy, but I may give it preceding a surgical intervention 2 to 4 days before surgery, or in completely lasered eyes if there's a recurrent bleed, again with counseling, that if traction increases, you may need surgery. Ladies and gentlemen, judicious use of anti-VEGF agents as part of a multi-pronged attack is definitely helpful to preserve and improve vision in patients with diabetic retinopathy, and we can possibly maintain that vision in almost indefinitely if we go the right way. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dinesh, for a lovely and lucid presentation. And for paucity of time, we will not have any questions right now. I will ask Dr. Vishal to share his screen. In fact, I may have to forego my presentation, but I think Vishal and followed by Dr.
Yes, sir, I'm sharing my presentation.
And Vishal, if you can use the PDR part within the same thing so that we could connect off. Just one or two videos.
Share it 1 second.
So Dinesh, while Vishal is sharing, if the visual acuity in a patient is to begin with is poor, say it is less than 20 by 50 or it is less 6 by 18, would you choose a different anti-VEGF agent?
Yeah, I would give the patient a choice of aflibercept.
Okay. Yeah,
Can I start?
Yes, please.
Thank you, Dr. Ajay, for having me here for this wonderful IC. And we have been a part of this IC for a couple of years now. So, sir, you want me to skip to the video part directly or?
No, you go as you feel like.
Okay, fine. I'll just skip to the slides.
We have about 20 minutes with you and Dr. Ritu have to cover. And then if I get 2-3 minutes, I'll cover my presentation.
Okay, sir. So as we know, DME patients suffer significant impairment of quality of life because of the high treatment burden associated with intensive injections. And the treatment is associated with substantial medical cost as well, which adds on to the work loss for young patients and their attendants for injection appointments. And of course, anxiety and high expectations lead to a negative impact on the long-term pharmacological therapy. There is frequent delay or decreased appointments in intravitreal injection. And furthermore, results from real-life studies are not comparable with the data known from our RCTs. And the final is refractory treatment. We always in our clinic see refractory patients to anti-VEGF and steroid implants, and the proportion of patients achieving significant BCVA in this subgroup of patients are lower. As we all know, the current gold standard of therapy has gone from macular laser photoablation now to anti-VEGF agents, and in some special cases, steroid implants are the first choice drugs in which there is an inflammatory component. Coming to the surgery for DME, we can categorize three indications for surgery for diabetic macular edema. That is the tractional macular edema, refractive macular edema, and treatment naive macular edema without any previous pharmacological therapy. So the rationale between the traction element is easy to find. That is, the resolution of DME is by releasing the traction anterior, posterior, and tangential by removing the vitreomacular traction, the hyaloid, all the membranes, the epiretinal membrane, and the ILM. In fact, DRCRNet was the only prospective trial conducted for vitrectomy for DME, in which they found that 40% patients improved 2 lines, and there was a decreased subfoveal thickness by 160 microns. But the caveat here is 22% also of the patients also lost 10 or more lines in this study. Refractive edema by definition is macular edema which has continued for more than 6 months after repeated non-surgical treatments and absence of any evidence of any tractional force. And the rationale for vitrectomy non-tractional edema is now that small gauge vitrectomy is a proven treatment option because it is safe and it reduces macular thickness in cases of DME by increasing the vitreous oxygenation, reduction of VEGF levels, cytokine levels, and adding a ILM peeling over that is beneficial for the anatomical resolution of DME. As I said before, modern vitrectomy systems with advanced visualization techniques has made macular surgery safe with improved results. The third category, the rationale between for vitrectomy in DME for the treatment of treatment naive macular edema is still controversial. Now few studies have come in which they have mentioned PPV with ILM peeling as the first line option in the treatment, and the logic here is that in refractory edema, when you go for a vitrectomy, it is used as a rescue procedure in which the treatment results are limited due to the extensive damage because of the chronicity of the disease and the damage to the outer retinal layers. So the new studies say to go in early for treatment naive macular edema. Of course, we all have to be aware about the complications. They might be rare, but they still do occur in the best of hands in vitrectomy for DME, like retinal detachment, macular thinning, macular hole formation, endophthalmitis. The list can go on. So I'll come to the videos now. This is a video of vitreomacular traction, and you can see the main point here is after doing a vitrectomy, you go for multiple stainings because there is a presence of vitreoschisses and there is anomalous PVD, and you have to stain again and again with trypan blue, brilliant blue, and tricot to find the second membrane and then come to the ILM. So rushing through the surgery is not a good idea, and you have to be gentle to the posterior pole tissues because they are more friable than the normal tissues in the normal ILM peeling case. So this is the the posterior hyaloid being removed, and it's thick and it's adherent, and you remove it gently. You can see the hard exudate plaque at the fovea. After that removal, you go with the trypan blue, and this is the ERM over the macula which is being removed. And some amount of ILM along with the ERM is getting removed with it. And around a 2 disc diameter of ILM peeling and a ERM peeling is enough for restoration of the macular contour in these cases. This is one more case in which we can beautifully see the role of multiple stains and multiple layer peeling. So we have stained this posterior pole with triamcinolone acetonide and trypan blue, Now we are going to remove the ERM and the posterior hyaloid remnants over the posterior pole. And they have these, appendages, extending beyond the arcade. So you have to be very careful while peeling them so as to not cause any iatrogenic breaks. And after this layer has been removed, we again stain with brilliant blue G dye, and now you can see the ILM quite visible, which was not seen previously. And then you do a 2-disc diameter peeling of the ILM in these cases. I always add, some amount of laser to the ischemic areas to give me better results. Some authors have, suggested adding anti-VEGF at the end of the procedure or a steroid implant with variable results at the end of the procedure. So the main technique of the surgery is similar to treatment naive macular edema also, although I don't do it, but people say that most surgeons say that the concept is the same, that you do a vitrectomy and you do a 2-disc or 3-disc diameter ILM peeling at the macula. Of course, this video is just to show you that complications do occur because of the friable retina, and in this case the ILM was getting peeled. We were peeling it, and we ended up de-roofing the macula because it was a cystic macula, and we created a iatrogenic macular hole in the post-op period, and this is the post-op period photograph. So to conclude, the current gold standard treatment for DME is anti-VEGF therapy. Vitrectomy remains an important tool in treatment of select cases of DME, intracranial DME and refractory DME. With the invent of modern vitrectomy surgery systems with small gauge instruments and advanced visualization, which offer a promise of safe surgery with improved efficacy. Of course, for treatment naive cases and refractory cases in which vitrectomy is done, there are no prospective studies right now. All the large studies are retrospective in nature. So for the prospective studies are needed to define the role of early PPV in these cases. And finally, intraoperative complications and the concept that a thinner macula does not correlate with the improved visual acuity should be amply clear to the surgeon also, and should be made adequately clear during counseling to the patient also. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Vish. Thank you so much, Vishal, for those lovely videos which you are famous for. I will ask Dr. Ritu to share her screen, and Vishal, if you could just in the meantime have a video which you wanted to show for the PDR. If time permits, we will have it at after Dr. Ritu's talk, and if the hall coordinator permits us, we might be able to get a little time extra. We may or may not. Let's see.
Sure, sir.
Okay. Thanks. Yeah, Dr. Ritu. She'll be talking to us on management of cataract in diabetic retinopathy.
Good evening, and thank you for the opportunity. And as we all know that cataract is really, extremely common in diabetic patients. It's much more common because it can develop rapidly and also at a younger age. And at any time, almost 1/4 of our cataract surgery patients, in fact, do have diabetes. And in order to optimize the outcome, the visual outcome of such patients, as we've already seen so many complications in their, diabetic patients with retinopathy, we need to give them special attention. So the indications of cataract surgery could be an advanced cataract where you have a poor visualization of the retina, where we need to monitor the diabetic retinopathy or give treatment. It could be a combined surgery with a VR surgery, or it could be also a patient with an associated glaucoma. So the main concerns that we're dealing with, as we know, is this post-op cystoid macular edema, which is much more common in diabetic patients as compared to normal patients. A worsening of the diabetic macular edema, which is already pre-existing. Such patients can also progress to PDR. There can be increased inflammation, or there could be a risk of infection in poorly controlled diabetics. And it is also a more challenging surgery, especially in patients who have already undergone a VR surgery or who've received several injections. Now, a comprehensive management is important preoperatively, certain intraoperative methods to reduce the inflammation and to improve the outcomes, and post-operative treatment. Now, preoperatively, as Dr. Dinesh Talwar had already said, a systemic control and evaluation is very important in such patients. And such patients, we need to see that their sugar is well controlled, HbA1c is well controlled. and also look at the lipid profile and other parameters. Here is another example of a patient who had diabetic macular edema, center involving, and with 1 year of good systemic control, you can see how beautifully the retina has cleared up, and such a patient is now suitable for going ahead for cataract surgery. If we had done it earlier, then we would not have got an optimal outcome. So as we know that the HbA1c should be controlled, Dr. Ajay already said that it should be less than 7%, but at the same time, we must, liaison with the diabetologist that it should be a gradual decrease, because a sudden reduction in the HbA1c has been shown to worsen the diabetic retinopathy. So a slow one, every month, maybe 0.5 to 1% reduction in HbA1c is good, but not a very rapid one. And such patients should be followed up very frequently for their fundus examination. So preoperatively in the anterior segment, the things that we really want to look at is these patients have more inflammation. And so starting them on pre-op NSAIDs 1 week preoperatively, whether Nepafenac, Bromfenac, or Ketorolac, such patients are also continued 4 to 8 weeks post-operatively, and that helps to reduce the inflammation and reduce the incidence of CME. Managing the ocular surface preoperatively, as we know, diabetic patients, their epithelium cornea is not so healthy. They have hypoesthesia and many other problems. These things should be managed, and an unstable tear film can also give you very variable keratometric readings. So take a week or two to manage the ocular surface before taking them up for surgery. Again, do not miss looking at the iris, because such patients, if they have a mature cataract and you see that they have NVI, it does indicate the patient has PDR. And accordingly, you can prognosticate and manage the PDR first before going ahead for surgery. Glaucoma is often coexisting, and accordingly, we have to see whether we want to do a cataract surgery alone if the patient is only on one medication, or we want to plan out a combined surgery in cases where the patient is on maximum medical therapy. So the posterior segment management should always precede the anterior segment management, provided the visibility permits. However, if the patient, the clarity of the lens, if the patient has an advanced cataract, then obviously we have to go ahead for the cataract surgery and then manage the posterior segment subsequently. So depending upon the stage, we've already heard all the experts telling us the management for various grades of diabetic retinopathy. And here one would just like to say that patients who have little or no retinopathy, they can be suitable candidates for going ahead for an early cataract surgery. So patients with no diabetic retinopathy or mild to moderate NPDR, early surgery should be done. Whereas those patients who have maculopathy or PDR, first of all, refer them to your retina specialist. Let them manage the posterior segment first, optimize it, and then plan the cataract surgery. So intraoperatively, a few of the problems that we can face is poor pupil dilation and intraoperative miosis. Also, the endothelial dysfunction is there, so we need to take care of that. There may be associated zonular instability, especially in patients who've undergone multiple intravitreal injections, and the patients are often having advanced cataracts. So use a good viscoelastic to protect the endothelium. Be prepared with the pupillary expanders, CTR, capsular hooks, and we must always have a 3-piece lens as a backup, just in case we have any instability in the zonules. So a careful biometry, especially in patients who've undergone VR surgery, one needs to look at that. And choosing a hydrophobic lens is always preferable. And here I would say that there are a lot of advanced technology lenses now available. And in patients who are well-controlled diabetics with little or no diabetic retinopathy, yes, after due counseling, you can go ahead for a multifocal lens. But patients with advanced diabetic retinopathy who are on injections or who may require a vitrectomy later, in such patients, a multifocal lens would definitely be a contraindication. Avoid using anterior chamber IOLs or iris fixated lenses. A scleral fixated lens would be preferable where you do not have adequate posterior capsular support. So just a few pearls that you may prefer to do it under anesthesia. You must have an optimal size rhexis so that the posterior segment can be visualized after surgery. Use a good viscoelastic to protect the endothelium. And in patients where you may have a posterior capsular defect, in patients who've undergone multiple injections and you find them having a posterior subcapsular cataract, in such cases, you may want to avoid a hydrodissection. And capsule polishing should be meticulous, and preferably the lens must be in the IOL bag to avoid inflammation, and remove all the viscoelastic to avoid a IOP spike in the post-op period. In case the patient is going in for a combined surgery, then you would like to suture the incision so that laser can be done post-operatively. And here I would like to specify that inflammation is, management of the inflammation is extremely important. So giving them aggressive topical steroids, NSAIDs in the post-op period, a regular checkup for glaucoma, and definitely a close follow-up with a retina consultant is important. In case of PCO,
sorry to interrupt, kindly conclude in 2 minutes.
Yes.
Thank you.
So I would just end with that overall the visual outcome is very good with the advanced technique of phacoemulsification that we follow. And if we manage the comorbidities preoperatively, then the post-op results can be good. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dr. Ritu, for that wonderful presentation. And I'm so fortunate that Dr. Ritu is the anti-resectment surgeon in our center, and we have, it's good to work as a team where I'm so confident of managing the retina when she is operating. And I think we have finished recently on time. The only thing we have missed, we have missed out is a talk on laser. So I briefly mentioned, because for paucity of time, that we've for the centers involving diabetic macular edema, we use anti-VEGF injections. But if it is an extra foveal lesion, as Manpreet showed, and Dr. Dinesh also mentioned, there we can treat the microaneurysms. We have been using micropulse laser also in these cases. We have also done a micropulse PRP, which I thought I'll show you, but can't. So where we actually treat the NVEs and treat rest of the retina with a micropulse PRP, and is showing us good results. Steroids we normally want to use in patients who are pseudophakic with especially a cystoid macular edema. There are certain biomarkers which tell us that steroids will be effective. And those cases we have used IVCA, we've used Ozurdex, and we have data on FAME study for the fluocinolone acetonide. And we have at our center been using a suprachoroidal injection of triamcinolone, where the intraocular pressure doesn't go up and is giving us wonderful results. So that is a combination of various modalities like anti-VEGFs, steroids, judicious cataract surgery with large capsular rhexis and good polishing of the posterior capsule. And as Vishal said, that we should use appropriate time vitrectomy with the prior intravitreal injections. Of course, we would have loved to see some of his videos on PDA, but for paucity of time, we can't. And as Dinesh told us, how anti-VEGFs can be judiciously used both in DME and PDR. If there's anything else which anybody else, Vishal, Manpreet, Dinesh, Neeraj, or Dr. Ritu, if you wish to add, please go ahead.
Unfortunately, Dr. Arora, we'll have to conclude the session.
Yeah, I just want to, that's fine. So, Dr. Just one comment if anybody has.
I think, sir, it is very well covered, but just when you have to intervene, I think more and more aggressive approach to diabetic macular edema is being, being seen and heard in conferences. But I still will be, I'm an aggressive surgeon myself, but I won't jump into vitrectomy for macular edema without trying pharmacological therapy. That's
I think that's well taken.
I have one comment to make, Ajay.
Yes, sir.
Sir,
all of you.
Good evening, sir.
All of you are looking very smart.
You are with the tie, sir. You are smart.
Nothing compared to you with the red shirt and the tie.
And the yellow background. And the yellow background.
You look
so why I'm wearing the red shirt, Ajay?
Yeah.
This is a DMK color. I met the chief minister.
Oh,
Oh, wow. So I am actually expecting you to see you as a CM of Tamil Nadu very soon.
Not
Very soon.
Well. Ladies
Okay,
and
sir.
gentlemen,
All
let
right.
me allow me
Yeah.
to intervene. Dr. Arora, we
I
have to
must thank
conclude this.
I must thank my co-instructors for this lovely course. I wish we had more time to cover up more practical topics, but thank you all very much. Thanks a lot. And
Well,
thanks,
as they
Dr.
say-
Mohan Rajan, for meeting on the virtual space like this and seeing you so bright and good.
always. You too.
Hi.
Right.
I will stay back for Dr. Mohan Rajan's session.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you so
Thanks,
much,
Rishabh.
Dr.
Thank you so much.
Arora. You've been hosting this session like a free-flowing river. That was really pleasant of you. Thank you so much.